Welcome back to Part 2. Having explored the skies in the first part, we now turn our eyes to the ground and the ocean depths. Steel beasts, the Tiger and Panther. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, was supposed to be another lightning victory, another demonstration of German military superiority. But when German armored forces encountered the Soviet T-34 medium tank and the KV-1 heavy tank, they received a shock that reverberated all the way to the highest levels of command. These Soviet tanks were superior to anything Germany had fielded. The T-34's sloped armor, wide tracks for mobility, and powerful 76mm gun made it a formidable opponent. German tank commanders found their shells bouncing off T-34 armor, while Soviet guns penetrated their own vehicles with ease. This was unacceptable. Germany had built its military doctrine around armored warfare. The panzer divisions had swept across Poland and France, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of concentrated tank formations. Now, suddenly, German tanks were outclassed. The response was immediate and desperate. Emergency specifications were issued for new German tanks that could compete with and surpass Soviet armor. Two designs would emerge from this requirement: the Panther medium tank and the Tiger heavy tank. Both would become legendary. Both would strike fear into Allied tank crews. And both would exemplify the German tendency toward over-engineering that contributed to their ultimate defeat. The Tiger. I first entered combat in September 1942 near Leningrad, and it immediately established a reputation for near invincibility. Weighing 57 tons and protected by armor up to 100 millimeters thick on the front, the Tiger was a mobile fortress. Its main gun was the feared 88mm WK-36, derived from the famous Flak 88 anti-aircraft gun that had already proven devastatingly effective against tanks in North Africa. This gun could penetrate 100 millimeters of armor at ranges up to 1,000 meters. In British firing trials, gunners scored 5 consecutive hits on a target, just 16 by 18 inches, at a range of 1,200 yards. The combination of thick armor and powerful, accurate firepower made the Tiger fearsome in combat. Allied tank crews quickly learned to fear the Tiger. In Tunisia, British Churchill tank crews watched in dismay as 8 rounds fired from their 75mm guns ricocheted off a Tiger's armor from a distance of just 150 feet. Meanwhile, a Tiger could destroy a Churchill or Sherman from over a mile away. The psychological impact was immense. Allied tank commanders developed tactics specifically to deal with Tigers, often requiring multiple tanks working together to flank and destroy a single Tiger. But the Tiger had significant flaws. It was expensive to produce, costing 250,000 Reichsmarks compared to 100,000 for a Panzer IV. It was mechanically complex and prone to breakdowns. The overlapping road wheel design, while providing better ride quality and distributing ground pressure more evenly, was a maintenance nightmare. Snow and mud could pack between the overlapped wheels and freeze overnight in Russian winters. Soviet tankers learned to attack at dawn when Tiger tracks were frozen solid. The Tiger was also slow and cumbersome compared to medium tanks, making it vulnerable to flanking attacks. Only 1,347 Tiger IIs were built between August 1942 and August 1944, far fewer than the thousands of Shermans or T-34s produced by the Allies. Each Tiger required extensive maintenance and consumed fuel at an alarming rate. As Germany's fuel supplies dwindled in the later stages of the war, Tigers were often abandoned by their crews when they ran out of fuel, their superior armor and firepower rendered useless by an empty tank. The Tiger II, also known as the King Tiger or Königstiger, represented Germany's attempt to create an even more powerful tank. Entering service in 1944, the Tiger II combined the Tiger's firepower with the sloped armor design of the Panther. At nearly 70 tons, it was one of the heaviest tanks to see combat in World War II. Its armor was virtually impenetrable from the front by any Allied tank gun. The long-barreled 88mm KWK-43 could penetrate 5 inches of armor at a range of over a mile. But the Tiger II took all of the Tiger I's problems and amplified them. It was extremely expensive, even more mechanically unreliable, and consumed fuel voraciously. Its weight made it slow and difficult to maneuver. Bridges couldn't support it. It couldn't use roads without destroying them. And most critically, by the time it entered service in mid-1944, Germany lacked the fuel, spare parts, and trained crews to employ it effectively. Only 492 Tiger IIs were ever built, compared to Germany's request for 1,500. Allied bombing of the Henschel factories cut production drastically. The Panther tank represented a different approach. Designed specifically to counter the T-34, the Panther was lighter and more mobile than the Tiger, while still being heavily armed and armored. Weighing 48 tons, about the same as the original Tiger I, but carrying more advanced technology, the Panther featured excellent sloped armor that gave it effective protection equivalent to much thicker vertical armor. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun, while smaller in caliber than the Tiger's 88mm, had superior armor penetration at shorter ranges due to its higher muzzle velocity. The Panther's sloped frontal armor was so effective that it could deflect hits from most Allied anti-tank guns. The angled 80mm glacis plate provided protection equivalent to 139mm of vertical armor. This meant that from the front, a Panther was nearly as well protected as a Tiger, despite using less actual armor thickness. The design was ingenious, providing maximum protection for minimum weight. But Panthers, too, suffered from reliability problems, particularly early in their service life. The first Panthers deployed at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 experienced catastrophic mechanical failures. Engines caught fire. Transmissions broke down. Of the approximately 200 Panthers committed to the battle, many were lost to mechanical problems rather than enemy action. These issues were eventually addressed through design modifications, but the Panther's reputation for unreliability persisted. Around 6,000 Panthers were produced, making it much more common than the Tiger, but still nowhere near the production numbers of Allied tanks. The Panther was faster and more agile than the Tiger, with better cross-country mobility. Military historians still debate whether the Panther was the best tank of World War II, but it's certainly one of the contenders. Its combination of firepower, protection, and mobility was exceptional for its time. Yet, even these superb tanks couldn't change Germany's strategic situation. Tank design doesn't occur in a vacuum. Germany built the best tanks, but in insufficient numbers. The Soviet Union built good enough tanks in overwhelming numbers. The United States built adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers and with better reliability. A Sherman or T-34 might lose a one-on-one duel with a Tiger or Panther, but the Allies could afford to lose 3 or 4 tanks to destroy one German heavy tank, and they had the industrial capacity to replace their losses, while Germany did not. The resource allocation question haunts any analysis of German tanks. Would Germany have been better served by producing more Panzer IVs and assault guns, instead of smaller numbers of Tigers and Panthers? The Panzer IV was cheaper, simpler, more reliable, and easier to maintain. You could produce 2 or 3 Panzer IVs for the cost of 1 Tiger. The same question applies to the absurd, super-heavy tank projects like the 188-ton Maus, of which only 2 prototypes were built before being captured by the Soviets. These resources could have been used elsewhere. German tanks also reflected the broader problem of German military production under the Nazis. Too many competing designs, constant modifications disrupting production, and interference from Hitler himself. Hitler's obsession with bigger and more powerful tanks drove specifications upward, making the tanks heavier, more expensive, and harder to produce. When Albert Speer became armaments minister, he tried to rationalize production, but by then it was too late. The legacy of German tank design extended well beyond the war. The T-54/55, which became the most produced tank in history, incorporated lessons learned from studying German tanks. The British Centurion, one of the most successful tank designs ever, benefited from analysis of captured German vehicles. American post-war tanks adopted various features from German designs. The concept of sloped armor, the importance of gun penetration power, the balance between armor, firepower, and mobility. These lessons shaped tank design for decades. Standing in front of a Tiger or Panther today in a museum, you can understand why Allied tank crews feared them. They're massive, imposing, bristling with lethal capability. But you can also see the complexity, the over-engineering, the flaws that prevented them from being the war-winning weapons Germany needed. They were remarkable machines, technological achievements that deserve respect. But they were also products of a regime that valued perfection over practicality, quality over quantity, and technological superiority over strategic sense. The silent threat, Type 21 U-boat. The Type 21 U-boat represented perhaps the most revolutionary weapon Germany developed during World War II. Unlike the V-2, which was an offensive terror weapon, or the Me-262, which was a defensive fighter, the Type 21 was designed to reverse Germany's fortunes in the Battle of the Atlantic, the prolonged struggle for control of the sea lanes that had been effectively lost by 1943. This wasn't just an improved submarine. It was a fundamental reimagining of what a submarine could be. For the first time, engineers designed a vessel meant to operate primarily underwater, rather than a surface ship that could temporarily submerge. The Type 21 was, in many ways, the first true submarine. Traditional submarines of the era were really submersibles. They spent most of their time on the surface, using diesel engines for propulsion and to charge their batteries. They would submerge to attack or evade detection, running on battery power for limited periods before needing to surface again. The Type 21 turned this concept on its head. With 3 times the battery capacity of earlier U-boats, it could remain submerged for days at a time. Its streamlined hull design allowed it to achieve the unprecedented feat of being faster underwater than on the surface. 17.2 knots submerged versus 15.6 knots on the surface. The design incorporated numerous innovations. The figure-8 cross-section hull maximized interior space for the massive battery banks. The sail was streamlined with all the protrusions and platforms common to earlier submarines eliminated in favor of a smooth profile that reduced drag. Hydraulic systems operated the rudder, diving planes, and torpedo tube doors, marking the first extensive use of hydraulic power in submarine design. The boats carried 6 torpedo tubes in the bow, with a revolutionary rapid reload system that could have all 6 tubes ready to fire again just 10 minutes after the first salvo, compared to an hour or more for earlier designs. Perhaps most importantly, the Type 21 included a snorkel as part of its original design, not as an afterthought. The snorkel allowed the submarine to run its diesel engines while remaining at periscope depth, recharging batteries without fully surfacing. This made the Type 21 extremely difficult to detect. It could cross the Bay of Biscay, the area Allied aircraft had turned into a killing ground for U-boats, completely submerged. The valley of death that had claimed so many U-boats would have been a thing of the past for the Type 21. The boat's living conditions were also dramatically improved compared to earlier U-boats. The crew of 57 men had better berthing, actual showers, air conditioning, and freezer storage for food. These weren't luxuries. They were practical improvements that allowed longer patrols with crews who remained healthy and effective, rather than exhausted and demoralized. Attack procedures for the Type 21 were radically different. The submarine would detect a target, then run at full speed on a direct collision course while remaining at depth without using the periscope. The Fire Control Center could calculate the target's distance and bearing based on sonar data alone. After firing torpedoes, the Type 21 would escape at high speed while submerged. Most Allied sonar of the era couldn't track targets moving faster than about 13 knots. The Type 21 could run at 17 knots, submerged. Germany's leadership recognized the Type 21's potential. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had commanded the U-boat force before becoming overall naval commander, saw the Electroboot, as it was nicknamed, as the weapon that could reverse Allied dominance of the Atlantic. The plan was ambitious: mass production, using prefabricated sections built at different sites and assembled at shipyards. This modular construction approach was revolutionary for shipbuilding. The goal was 30 boats per month by autumn 1945, with the first boats operational by spring 1945. But as with Germany's other wonder weapons, reality fell far short of ambition. The prefabrication approach, while theoretically sound, ran into severe practical problems. The factories building the sections lacked skilled workers and had no experience with precision shipbuilding. Quality control was poor. When sections arrived at the assembly yards, they often didn't fit together properly, requiring extensive rework. Allied bombing targeted the assembly facilities, causing delays and forcing relocations. The plan to build sections in underground factories and assemble them in bomb-proof bunkers was partially thwarted when RAF bombers dropped massive Tall Boy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs that could penetrate even the thick concrete shelters. The Type 21 also suffered from serious design flaws that only became apparent in testing. The hydraulic systems, while innovative, were overly complex and vulnerable to damage because key components were located outside the pressure hull. The engines were underpowered, limiting surface speed and requiring longer charging times. The snorkel, while a good idea in principle, proved difficult to use in practice. Most critically, the rushed production and use of inexperienced workers led to poor structural integrity. The submarines were more vulnerable to depth charges than earlier U-boats and had a shallower maximum diving depth. A total of 118 Type 21 U-boats were commissioned before the war ended, but only one U-2511 completed a war patrol. She sailed from Norway on May 3, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. When she received orders to cease hostilities on May 4th, her commander, Adalbert Schnee, was already heading back to port. During the return voyage, U-2511 came across the British heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk and conducted a practice attack, demonstrating that she could have sunk the cruiser with ease. Schnee withheld fire, honoring the ceasefire. It was a demonstration of what might have been. Post-war analysis by the United States Navy concluded that while the Type 21 had admirable features, the design was seriously flawed and the submarines were poorly built. The judgment of naval historian Clay Blair was harsh. The Type 21 could not have made a big difference in the Battle of the Atlantic, given its problems with engines, hydraulics, structural weakness, and manufacturing quality. Yet the Type 21's influence on submarine design cannot be overstated. After the war, the United States raised and tested U-2 513 and U-3008 extensively. The Soviets captured several Type 20s and studied them intensely. The knowledge gained from these submarines directly influenced the next generation of submarine designs. The American Guppy Modernization Program, which upgraded World War II fleet submarines, incorporated Type 21 concepts. Soviet Whiskey-class submarines borrowed heavily from the German design. American Tang-class, British Porpoise-class, and Swedish Hagen III-class submarines all showed Type 21 influence. U-2 540, scuttled at the end of the war, was raised in 1957 and refitted as the research vessel Wilhelm Bauer for West Germany's Bundesmarine. She served until 1983 and is now a museum ship in Bremerhaven, the only surviving Type 21. Walking through her cramped compartments today, you can see both the promise and the problems. The battery banks are massive. The torpedo room is clearly designed for rapid reloading, but you can also see the complexity of the hydraulic systems and understand why they caused so many problems. The Type 21 represented Germany's attempt to win the Battle of the Atlantic with technology rather than numbers. By 1943, Allied shipbuilding had far outpaced U-boat sinkings. Improved Allied anti-submarine warfare was destroying U-boats faster than they could be replaced. Germany needed a game changer. The Type 21 could have been that game changer if it had been ready 2 years earlier, if it had been properly engineered, if it had been built with better quality control, if there had been fuel to run it and trained crews to man it. But if doesn't win wars. The Type 21 came too late, worked poorly, and existed in numbers too small to matter. Like the Me 262, like the V2, like the Tiger tank, it demonstrated German engineering brilliance and strategic futility in equal measure. The price of wonder, slave labor, and strategic failure. The Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp existed for one purpose: to build Hitler's wonder weapons. Located in central Germany, the camp supplied forced labor for the underground factory complex carved into the Kohnstein mountain. Here, in tunnels blasted from solid rock, prisoners worked 12-hour shifts assembling V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets under conditions that can only be described as hell on earth. The prisoners never saw sunlight. They slept in the tunnels, breathing rock dust and toxic fumes from the blasting. Ventilation was minimal. The noise from construction and from trains hauling rock was constant and deafening. Sanitation consisted of oil barrels cut in half. The smell became unbearable. Disease spread rapidly through the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, typhoid, and dysentery killed thousands. Those who didn't die of disease died of malnutrition, exhaustion, or brutal punishment by SS guards. Of the approximately 60,000 prisoners who passed through Mittelbau-Dora and its subcamps, between 20,000 and 25,000 died. This wasn't collateral damage. It was murder. The death rate was deliberately maximized through starvation rations, impossible working conditions, and systematic abuse. More people died building V-2 rockets than were killed by them. The same applied to the V-1. The wonder weapons were built on a foundation of corpses. Wernher von Braun visited Mittelbau-Dora multiple times. He saw the conditions. He knew prisoners were dying. After the war, he claimed ignorance of the full extent of the horror, but documentary evidence suggests he was far more aware than he later admitted. The V-2 rocket, the technological marvel that would eventually take humans to the moon, was created through slave labor and mass murder. This uncomfortable truth haunted the post-war space program and von Braun himself. The human cost of the wonder weapons extended beyond the concentration camp victims. The weapons themselves killed thousands of Allied civilians. But there's another cost that's harder to quantify: the opportunity cost. What could Germany have accomplished if it had allocated the resources spent on wonder weapons differently? The V-2 program consumed enormous resources. Each rocket cost as much as a bomber aircraft, but delivered less explosive power to the target and could only be used once. The entire program, including development, production facilities, and the rockets themselves, diverted materials, labor, and industrial capacity from other uses. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, later admitted that the resources spent on the V-2 might have been better used producing more conventional weapons. The same argument applies to other wonder weapons. The Me-262, while impressive, required exotic materials and complex manufacturing processes. Would Germany have been better served by producing more conventional fighters that could have been built in greater numbers? The Tiger and Panther tanks were superior to Allied tanks, but they were expensive and mechanically complex. Could Germany have built 3 Panzer IVs for the cost of 1 Tiger and been better off strategically? Some historians argue that the wonder weapons actually hastened Germany's defeat rather than delaying it, by consuming resources that could have been used more effectively, by focusing on complex, unproven technologies rather than proven systems, by pursuing multiple competing projects rather than concentrating on a few priorities. Germany weakened its conventional forces. The Soviet Union didn't waste resources on wonder weapons. They built good enough tanks and aircraft in overwhelming numbers. They focused on mass production and reliability rather than technological sophistication. The strategic failures went beyond resource allocation. German military production under the Nazis was characterized by chaos and inefficiency. Different branches of the military competed for resources and pursued duplicate projects. Hitler himself interfered constantly, demanding modifications and changing priorities. The German military never achieved the kind of centralized, rational production planning that characterized American war production. Consider the contrasting approaches to fighter production. Germany produced multiple different fighter types: the Bf-109, the Fdu-190, the Me-262, the He-162, various others. Each type required different parts, different maintenance procedures, different training programs. The United States, by contrast, focused on mass-producing a smaller number of proven designs: the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning. This allowed for economies of scale, simplified logistics, and more efficient training. The wonder weapons also reflected Hitler's belief in technological shortcuts to victory. Rather than addressing the fundamental strategic problems Germany faced: overextension on multiple fronts, insufficient resources, hostile populations in occupied territories, Hitler sought miracle weapons that could somehow reverse the tide. This was magical thinking, not strategy. No weapon, however advanced, could overcome the massive manpower and industrial advantages the Allies possessed by 1943. The moral implications of the Wonder Weapons program extend beyond the slave labor used to build them. These were primarily terror weapons designed to kill civilians and break morale rather than achieve military objectives. The V weapons had minimal military impact. They didn't significantly disrupt the Allied war effort. They didn't prevent D-Day. They didn't force Britain to negotiate. What they did accomplish was the murder of thousands of civilians, many of them women and children, in indiscriminate attacks on cities. This reflected a broader truth about Nazi warfare: the deliberate targeting of civilians, the use of terror as a weapon, the complete disregard for the laws of war. The same regime that built concentration camps built weapons specifically designed to terrorize populations. The two weren't separate. They were part of the same evil system. After the war, the United States and Soviet Union competed to capture German scientists, technology, and production facilities. Operation Paperclip brought von Braun and about 1,600 other German scientists to America. The Soviets forcibly relocated approximately 6,000 German scientists and their families to Russia. Both superpowers essentially gave these scientists immunity from prosecution for their wartime activities in exchange for their knowledge. This raised profound moral questions that remain contentious to this day. Were the Allies right to recruit men who had worked for the Nazi regime, who had used slave labor, who had built weapons to kill Allied civilians? The pragmatic argument was that the Cold War was beginning, and technological superiority mattered. If the United States didn't recruit these scientists, the Soviets would. The knowledge existed and couldn't be unmade. Better to have it in American hands than Soviet ones. But this pragmatism came at a moral cost. It meant that men who had collaborated with evil faced no consequences for their actions. It meant that expertise was valued more highly than justice. It sent a message that if you were useful enough, you could escape accountability. Von Braun would go on to become a celebrated figure in America, the father of the space program, appearing on television, meeting presidents. The slaves who died building his rockets were forgotten. The victims of the wonder weapons, both those who built them and those they were used against, deserved better than to be footnotes in a story about technological achievement. The wonder weapons weren't wonders. They were weapons of terror, built through atrocity and used to commit atrocity. Whatever technological legacy they left, that moral reality shouldn't be forgotten. Legacy of the wonder weapons. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The rocket that had taken him there, the Saturn V, was designed by Wernher von Braun using principles and technologies developed for the V2. The direct lineage from Hitler's terror weapon to humanity's greatest exploration achievement is undeniable and uncomfortable. The wonder weapons of World War II cast long shadows across the remainder of the 20th century. The jet age owes its origins to the Me-262. Every jet fighter that followed incorporated lessons learned from Messerschmitt's design. The swept-wing configuration, the pod-mounted engines, the challenges of high-speed flight. German engineers had solved these problems first. When the Cold War turned hot in Korea, American F-86 Sabres fought Soviet MiG-15Es in the first jet versus jet combat. Both aircraft showed clear design influences from the Me-262. The Soviets had captured significant Me-262 technology and data. The Americans had done the same. Submarine warfare was transformed by the Type XXI. The concept of a true submarine, one that operated primarily underwater rather than on the surface, became the standard. Every diesel-electric submarine built in the 2 decades after World War II showed Type 21 influence. When the United States developed nuclear-powered submarines in the 1950s, starting with USS Nautilus in 1954, the Type 21's design principles were incorporated into these revolutionary vessels. The Soviet Union's submarine program relied heavily on captured German technology and recruited German engineers. Tank design evolved based on lessons learned from German armor. The importance of sloped armor, the balance between firepower and mobility, the value of a powerful main gun, these principles shaped the main battle tanks of the post-war era. The Soviet T-54/55, which became the most widely produced tank in history with over 100,000 built incorporated features inspired by German designs. The British Centurion, the American M60, successive generations of tanks all showed the influence of German engineering, but the most significant legacy was psychological and strategic. The wonder weapons demonstrated that technological superiority could be achieved through focused research and development, even by a nation losing a war. This lesson wasn't lost on the superpowers that emerged from World War II. The Cold War became, in many ways, a competition for technological superiority. Both sides invested enormous resources in developing advanced weapons, fearing that the other side might achieve a breakthrough that would shift the balance of power. The nuclear arms race, the space race, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, all of these efforts were driven by the same fear that had motivated the Manhattan Project. The fear that the enemy might get there first. The United States and Soviet Union recruited German scientists and engineers precisely because they understood that the next war might be won or lost by technological advancement. This created its own moral hazards. The pursuit of technological superiority became an end in itself, sometimes divorced from strategic sense or ethical considerations. Weapons programs consumed vast resources that could have been used for other purposes. The nuclear arms race produced arsenals capable of destroying human civilization multiple times over. The space race, while producing genuine scientific achievements, was fundamentally driven by military considerations. The question of what might have been if Hitler's wonder weapons had been deployed earlier or in greater numbers has fascinated historians and inspired countless alternative history scenarios. What if the Me 262 had been operational in 1943 with adequate fuel and trained pilots? What if the Type 21 had been ready in 1943 instead of 1945? What if Germany had achieved the atomic bomb before the Allies? Most serious historians conclude that while earlier deployment of these weapons might have prolonged the war and increased Allied casualties, they couldn't have changed the ultimate outcome. Germany's strategic situation was hopeless by 1943. The Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire combined had overwhelming advantages in population, industrial capacity, resources, and territory. No technological edge could have overcome these fundamental imbalances, but the might-have-beens remain haunting. If the jet fighters had forced the Allies to abandon or significantly reduce their daylight bombing campaign, German industrial production might have remained higher. If the Type 21 U-boats had successfully interdicted Atlantic shipping, the buildup for D-Day might have been delayed or disrupted, If the V weapons had been ready earlier and used in greater numbers against invasion preparations, the Normandy landings might have been postponed. These delays could have given Germany time to develop more weapons, to fortify its defenses further, to prolong the war into 1946 or beyond. The human cost of such a prolonged war would have been staggering. The Holocaust continued as long as Nazi Germany controlled territory. Every month the war lasted meant more victims of genocide. The atomic bombs used against Japan demonstrated the destructive power that would have been available if the war had continued. Some historians speculate that if Germany had held out until late 1945 or early 1946, the Allies might have used atomic weapons against German cities. The death toll could have dwarfed even the actual catastrophic losses of the war. The wonder weapons also raise questions about the relationship between technological brilliance and moral responsibility. The scientists and engineers who created these weapons were, in many cases, genuinely brilliant. They solved extremely difficult technical problems. They pushed the boundaries of what was possible, but they did so in service of an evil regime. Does technical achievement excuse moral failure? Can we separate the science from its application? These questions became particularly acute with the recruitment of German scientists after the war. Von Braun and his colleagues weren't passive victims of the Nazi regime. They were willing participants who benefited from it. Von Braun joined the SS and held the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to a major. He used slave labor from concentration camps. He knew about the conditions at Mittelbau-Dora. His enthusiastic service to the Third Reich was well documented. Yet, the American government decided that his expertise was more valuable than prosecuting him for potential war crimes. This pragmatic calculation troubled many at the time and continues to trouble people today. It established a precedent that technical expertise could earn immunity from consequences. It suggested that the end, in this case, Cold War advantage, justified the means. For the surviving victims of the Wonder Weapons program, the celebration of the scientists who had used them as slaves was particularly bitter. Survivors of Mittelbau-Dora watched as von Braun became a celebrity in America, appearing on television with Walt Disney to promote space exploration, meeting with presidents, receiving awards and honors. The disconnect between his public image and his wartime activities was jarring. Only in later decades did the full truth about the V-2 program's use of slave labor become widely known and acknowledged. The Wonder Weapons also demonstrated the limits of technology as a solution to strategic problems. Germany lost World War II not because it lacked advanced weapons, but because it had made catastrophic strategic decisions, invading the Soviet Union while still at war with Britain, declaring war on the United States after Pearl Harbor. These decisions created a strategic situation that no amount of technological sophistication could overcome. The United States learned from this. American post-war military policy emphasized not just technological superiority, but comprehensive strategic planning, strong alliances, overwhelming economic power, and the ability to sustain long conflicts. Technology mattered, but only as part of a broader framework. Today, the surviving wonder weapons rest in museums around the world. The V-2 at the Smithsonian, the Me-262 at the National Air and Space Museum, the Type XXI U-boat, Wilhelm Bauer in Bremerhaven. They're artifacts of a dark time, reminders of both human ingenuity and human evil. They demonstrate what can be achieved when brilliant minds are given resources and time to solve complex problems. They also demonstrate the terrible purposes to which such achievements can be put. Standing before these machines today, it's impossible not to feel a complex mixture of emotions. Admiration for the engineering skill they represent, horror at the purposes they served, sadness for the victims they killed and the slaves who built them. Wonder at how close Germany came to fielding weapons that might have prolonged the war. Relief that they came too late to change the outcome. The wonder weapons scared the world because they were real. They worked. They demonstrated capabilities that seemed like science fiction at the time. And they showed that totalitarian regimes with sufficient resources and ruthlessness could achieve technological breakthroughs that threatened free societies. This fear shaped the post-war world and the Cold War that followed. But in the end, the wonder weapons also demonstrated a fundamental truth. Wars are won not by weapons alone, but by strategy, resources, industrial capacity, alliances, and the will of peoples and nations. Germany had brilliant scientists and engineers. It had advanced technology. What it lacked was wise leadership, sufficient resources, and a cause worth fighting for. The Allies had all of these things. That's why they won, wonder weapons or not. Conclusion. The secret weapons of Nazi Germany represent one of the most fascinating and troubling chapters of World War II. They were genuine technological marvels, years ahead of their time, demonstrating the heights that human ingenuity could reach even in the midst of total war. The V-2 rocket would spawn the space age. The Me-262 would usher in the jet era. The Type XXI submarine would revolutionize naval warfare. German tanks would influence armored vehicle design for decades. Yet these achievements came at a terrible cost. Thousands of slave laborers died building the weapons. Thousands of civilians died when the weapons were used. Resources that might have been used more effectively were squandered on technological gambles. And ultimately, the wonder weapons failed to achieve their strategic objective. They didn't save Nazi Germany from defeat. The story of the wonder weapons is a reminder that technology is morally neutral. It can be used for good or evil, for creation or destruction, for liberation or oppression. The same rocket technology that bombed London also took humans to the moon. the same engineering brilliance that designed the Me-262 could have designed aircraft for peaceful purposes. But under the Nazi regime, these capabilities were directed toward death and destruction. It's also a reminder that technological superiority alone cannot overcome strategic failures. Germany made catastrophic strategic decisions that no amount of advanced weaponry could remedy. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the declaration of war on the United States, the systematic alienation of conquered peoples, these decisions created a strategic situation where defeat was inevitable, regardless of German technological advantages. For the Allied nations that defeated Nazi Germany, the wonder weapons were a wake-up call. They demonstrated that adversaries could achieve technological breakthroughs that might threaten national survival. This realization drove the Cold War arms race and the massive investment in military research and development that characterized the second half of the 20th century. The fear that the enemy might develop a war-winning weapon first became a driving force in international relations. The moral questions raised by the Wonder Weapons program remain relevant today. How do we balance the pursuit of scientific knowledge with ethical responsibility? What are our obligations to those who suffer in the creation of new technologies? How do we hold people accountable when their expertise makes them valuable? These questions didn't end with World War II. They continue to resonate in our modern world of rapid technological change. As we've explored the V weapons that rained terror from the skies, the jet fighters that rewrote the rules of aerial combat, the nuclear program that thankfully never succeeded, the tanks that dominated battlefields, and the submarines that revolutionized naval warfare, we've seen a consistent pattern. Brilliant technology, deployed too late, in insufficient numbers, at enormous cost, in service of a doomed cause. Hitler's wonder weapons scared the world because they showed what Nazi Germany was capable of achieving. They scared Allied leaders who understood that if these weapons had been ready, even a year or two earlier, the war might have taken a very different course. They scared civilians who experienced the terror of attacks against which there was no defense. But in the end, the wonder weapons became testaments to the futility of seeking technological solutions to strategic catastrophes. They demonstrated that genius and evil can coexist, that scientific brilliance doesn't equate to moral wisdom, and that the most advanced weapons cannot save a regime built on lies, hatred, and murder. The legacy of these weapons lives on, not just in museums, but in the technologies that shape our modern world. Every satellite launch traces its lineage to the V-2. Every jet aircraft owes a debt to the Me-262. Every submarine incorporates lessons from the Type XXI. We live in a world profoundly shaped by technologies developed in the service of Nazi Germany. That's an uncomfortable truth, but it's one we must acknowledge. As we remember the wonder weapons, we must also remember their victims, the civilians killed by V-2 rockets who never heard the weapons coming, the Allied air crews shot down by jet fighters, the slaves who died building these weapons in concentration camp factories, the survivors who watched as the scientists who had used them were celebrated and honored. The wonder weapons of Nazi Germany were marvels of engineering and monuments to human evil. They were the products of brilliant minds working in service of a murderous regime. They changed the world while failing to save the nation that created them. And they left us with questions about technology, morality, and responsibility that remain as relevant today as they were 80 years ago. If you found this deep dive into Hitler's secret weapons fascinating, please give this video a like and subscribe to World War II Tales for more in-depth explorations of the weapons, battles, and people that shaped World War II. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And let me know in the comments, which of these wonder weapons do you think had the greatest impact on post-war technology? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.